Well, good evening and happy Shabbat to everyone. We have a surprise this evening. Normally we would have Kirk and JB with us. Kirk is here. He might be in and out during the program. But for those who have listened for as long as we have done this, once upon a time in a faraway kingdom, there used to be a gentleman named Yoel. And Yoel was the man that was most responsible for getting all of these books, not only online, but he was my atheist devil's advocate when I began this. He was really a lousy atheist, to tell you the truth. So he wasn't the world's greatest sparring partner, but he was a good one. And he took that approach after he became part of the covenant into the program. And so there's probably 3 or 4 years of Yoel participating in this program. And guess who is with us this evening?
Hey,
hi, Yoel.
Thanks for having me.
Good evening. Shabbat shalom.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So hey, we've been following a little bit of the virus that has the whole world up in a panic, and as we might expect, it was Jews that have come up with a virus, an antibody for this virus and a vaccine for it. All you have to do to benefit from what they have developed is to be able to read the paragraph I'm going to share with you now in a manner that is phonetically accurate. I'm going to butcher it, so I have no immunity, but I at least want you to know that hope is on the way. This group is called the Magal. It's a biochemistry group in the Galilee area of Israel. He says the scientific framework for the vaccine is based upon a new protein expression vector, which forms and secretes a chimeric soluble protein that delivers the viral antigen into musical tissues by self-activated enterocytosis, causing the body to form antibodies against the virus. Now, anybody that can explain what I just read, I'm going to play Pope, gets a free pass into heaven. Now, I have been asked, and I made a number of comments that I did not consider the coronavirus a pandemic, and I didn't for 2 reasons. One is that it hadn't affected enough people, and the death rate the mortality rate is actually fairly low. Outside of the Hunan province in China, it's 1% of those that are infected. And that's really low for something that you would consider to be a worldwide pandemic. And the Hunan province, too, while it's 4%, it's probably 4% just because the onslaught of this was just so enormous. Their medical facilities were simply overwhelmed, and they didn't even have the ability to chronicle all of those and diagnose all of those that came down with the virus. They only knew for certain how many had died from it. So it's a 1% mortality rate. At this point, there's been less than 4,000 people that have died from it worldwide. To put that in perspective, all right, Yoel, you are our scientist here. What do you think the average number of people every year, according to the World Health Organization, I can't even pronounce that, that die each year from the flu?
Tons. Oh, it's in the hundreds of thousands.
It is.
What?
It is.
Yeah. So.
The minimum number is 300,000 a year. The maximum number is about 650,000 a year. So now you have this virus that has the news media up in arms and politicians trying to do all manner of things, and is an economic catastrophe for sure. And it's killed 3,500, 4,000 people, and yet the average flu season worldwide, and that's worldwide. The average flu season worldwide is between 300,000 and 650,000 deaths.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the reason why I'm just really not quite as panicked about this as so many other people seem to be.
Well, I think there's already been over 10 or 15,000 from the flu that have died
this year.
I'm sure. This year so far.
Correct. Yeah, considerably more than that this year alone. So they're just not in the same level of context. And I think context is everything when you're talking about a problem. Now, I will tell you that one thing about the coronavirus is that its contagious rates, its ability to be transferred from one person to another is extremely high. So if you're around somebody that has it, you have a high likelihood of getting it. So that's the biggest problem with this particular virus. That said, I want to pick back up with the ultimate virus, the most deadly pathogen in human history. Yahweh refers to it as the plague of death. That would be the religion of Christianity. Now, Christianity is, the Christian will tell you, it's based upon the three Gospels that provide a biography of Jesus' life. Of course, there's the problem, there was no Jesus, and none of the three are eyewitness accounts. They're all hearsay. Luke was Paul's attaché. He was part of Paul's posse, and we know that because of what's written in Colossians. Mark was also associated with Paul, and so when we read that, and then we have to deal with Matthew, and we find that this was a stunning number. 600 of Mark's 661 verses are incorporated into the text of the Gospel of Matthew. 90% is plagiarized out of Mark. There is a stunning percentage out of Luke. There are 220 statements taken directly from Luke. I mean, that's 820 statements. That means that 56% of Matthew is plagiarized from Mark, and 24% was plagiarized from Paul's associate, Luke. Only 20% of it that's original. Now, if you went to court and you say, okay, I've got 3 hearsay accounts that I'm going to bring here to prove my case, Judge. What do you think that the judge would do if you said, I have 3 hearsay accounts? There's not a single eyewitness here.
Throw it out of
do you
court.
think you would you be able to bring even one of them to the stand?
No.
No. Hearsay evidence is not allowed in any court of law. And that's all that exists because, well, as we found out last week, there was no disciple named Matthew. The disciple that was the tax collector was Lowy. He's dutifully called out by name in the 2 books that came before Matthew. He's called Lowy in both Mark and in Luke. So there was no Matthew as a disciple, and we have overwhelming evidence that the book that now calls itself the Gospel of Matthew wasn't written until 90 CE. We're talking about an entire generation after Yoshua's life. Matter of fact, there is no chance whatsoever that the person who wrote it was even alive during the time that these events played out. So we have 3 accounts written by people who were not in Jerusalem, likely not even alive when the events took place, and that were not obviously eyewitnesses. And the only one that can even make any claim, even a remote claim, to being an eyewitness is, 80% of it's plagiarized, and the person that it's ascribed to was falsified. That's not much in the way of credibility. And I know, you all, even before we get to the facts here, when we began this process a long time ago, you were kind of an interesting case, because when I would discover evidence like this, you'd say, yeah, well, what took you so long? Of course, that's the case.
as more of, what's the surprise? Everything in the renewed covenant, quote unquote, or the new covenant testament is inconsistent and counter to old covenant and original Torah, prophet, Psalms. So why even read it was kind of where I got. So I just, every time Craig would find another kink in the armor, I'd say, why are you reading that
why
stuff?
Why are you surprised? Why did you go there? The only thing that I found in the end that I could read was the Sermon on the Mount. And I just came to the conclusion that the Sermon on the Mount is likely unedited by Christians and is likely the result of an eyewitness writing this down, even though it's in a different language, because from beginning to end, it is overwhelmingly opposed to the Christian religion. I mean, it's so anti-Christian and so destructive to Christianity. And there really was no chance that some Christian between 100 CE and 350 CE would have written that. I mean, you'd have been tarred and feathered, or worse, if you had done it. You had an experience, Yoel, very early on. You were your dad's Jewish, your mom was a Catholic, and
that was my grandfather. It was my grandfather was escaped German Jew, and the rest of his family was all slaughtered in Poland. Towards the end, we found out just recently, actually, that they actually survived until about 45. His letters from my great-grandfather were actually published. That never got to my grandfather, but someone published them in a book called Letters from the Shoah, and it was kind of amazing to come across those. And then we saw an interview of actually someone who's a pretty successful and very articulate lawyer in Lexington, Kentucky, which is where my grandfather lived out the last few years of his life, last decade or two. But he was his babysitter in Magdeburg, Germany, was actually my grandfather's sister. And here they were living like 5-10 miles away from each other for 2 decades and had no idea. But that was also interesting to get some of that. But basically, he kind of, after that whole experience, didn't want anything to do with religion and was a little bit ostracized because he married a Catholic. And both of my parents were in that knuckles being wrapped by rulers and, beaten and just tortured all the time type of thing by the nuns and the priests, kind of Catholic school. And so my parents felt that they should at least give me a shot at being Catholic, although they didn't push me too much. But they said, finish your confirmation, and then it's up to you after that. But unfortunately, I failed my confirmation.
My recollection is you failed your confirmation because at the end of the confirmation, you have the opportunity for the first time to actually meet the priest, and it's his little responsibility to ask some questions because he's going to be the one confirming you. So how did you do with his questions?
When I got to the point when he, there were a lot that I kind of, I guess, didn't give him the answer he wanted, but the one that just shut down the whole interview was when he said, do you accept the Lord Jesus Christ as your Savior and all that? I said, well, I'm sorry, I can't say yes because it just seems all too far-fetched to me. And then he pulled in my parents to say basically, hey, your son is on his way to hell type of thing. And when my mom said, good for him for not just following like a good religious lemming, if that's what he believes, it's good that he, didn't just lie and stuck up for his beliefs. And he said, that's the kind of talk that gets you excommunicated, which is, for a Catholic, that's pretty hardcore stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that would mean you're guaranteed of going to hell according to the Catholic Church. So the priest was cavalier on saying, if you're going to disagree with me and my church, I'm going to see to it that you go to hell.
Yeah, I think the most offensive in that vein, though, was when we had our first kid, and my wife's parents one is still alive, but very, very, very Catholic, everyday Mass Catholic. And so we thought that would make them feel better if we went and got them baptized. Mm-hmm. We just felt, hey, it doesn't really mean much to us as atheists type of thing, but if you want to do the whole ceremony, go for it. And so we started calling around town here, and finally one of the Catholic churches actually returned our call after we left messages what we wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And they refused to baptize our child because we were not practicing Catholics at their church. And so I said, so basically, according to you, our child cannot go to heaven without being baptized. And therefore, you're saying because we're not going to go and fill your little collection plate, that you are fine with condemning our kid who's done nothing wrong to hell. And, hang up after that. It was a hang up after that. So,
Mama.
You aren't under our control, and you aren't paying us, so we don't want your kid. Wow, you're not going to let us corrupt your kids.
Yeah, I felt that was amazing, that they wouldn't even at least take a shot at trying to get the kid.
Exactly.
Of course, it would be interesting to ask them. Can you just explain to me so I have some concept here? Well, you dripping some water on my kid besides getting him wet. What are you accomplishing? We give him a shower once a day, so he's not immune to water. What are you accomplishing?
Well,
what do you think the answer to that would be?
Oh, you're never going to get a response that's cogent and thoughtful from any of those types of conversations.
Mark, even to ask them, okay, priest, you want me to accept the Lord Jesus Christ? Are you asking me? Are you telling me that was his last name? Was he? Was he Mr. Should he be Mr. Christ to me? I want to make sure I get this, and maybe you could explain to me, because I'm just curious, sir. Wasn't he Jewish? Could you please tell me how he could be Jesus? Sounds more like Zeus to me. Or could you tell me, how did he go about saving me? I'm really curious. How did he save me? What am I supposed to...
Yeah.
Tell me what I'm supposed to believe. Or...
whatever the priests and the teachers tell you to believe, that's what you believe, because they're the emissaries on earth. You don't have to listen to God. Listen to the people that are channeling him. That was pretty much the every time I had a question in any of those catechism things, because the confirmation for those who haven't had to put up with that kind of torment for whatever is, you go to catechism for years. You first communion, et cetera, and then 7th and 8th grade, I think it was, for 2 solid years, every week, you go at least 1 or maybe 2 hours a week to get trained on this. So I went through the whole thing, and all I had to do was put up with another hour, one more Mass, and be official and done with it, and I failed.
Good for you. Well, I would have a question when they're saying they claim that they're speaking for God. I'd say, all right, I've got this. Let's just call it a Bible here. Let's open it. This first guy here, his name was Moses. What ethnicity was he? Oh, Jew. Okay. The second one here is Yosha. Let's call it Joshua. What ethnicity was he? Oh, Jewish. Okay. Then let's go through the rest of these prophets. There's a guy named Isaiah. What race was he? How about Jeremiah? What race was he? In fact, can you tell me what race every one of these guys seem to be, because they all seem to be the same race. How is it then that God switched teams and all of a sudden decided that he was going to speak through Italians? Just curious. Why is the church so anti-Semitic if it claims to be based on Jesus and he was a Jew? I'm not sure I get this. Oh, and by the way, you claim now that all of the promises and all the authority that was given to the Jews originally has been transferred to you. First, could you show me where it says that? Because I just want to make sure it's there. Could you show me where it says that? You know, Sarah, where it says that Christians replace Israel and that the church replaces Jews? You know, Sunday replaces the Shabbat. Grace and the Gospels replace the Torah. Can you show me where it says that? Oh, and while you're looking, since you think that you're saying that everything was in that Old Testament was prophetic of this guy that you're calling Mr. Christ, can you point to a single prophecy where Mr. Christ is called out by name and it says that Mr. Christ is going to play this important role? Oh, let's just call him Jesus, because that might be easier. You know, we'll just go by first name, because I can't find a last name of any of these Jews back there. So let's just go to the first name, Jesus. Can you point out a single prophecy? Man, we've got 3,000 pages of prophecies. Can you find one for me that he's named?
Yeah, I was, of course, not that astute back then. No. but
wouldn't it be fun now?
All good segue for you to make all those points.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be fun now to be able to make any one of those?
Yeah, mine were much more blue collar. Like, do you really think the world is 6,000 years old? Or why are we, having to do this, ceremony over and over again? Does God really care about that? Because that was my constant one.
Why are you taking these cookies round cookies out of the oven, out of that magic box, and pouring grape juice and pretending it's blood? Why are we doing that once a week?
That was actually a very funny one. My little sister, she must have been about 4 or something, and this is one of those huge, grandiose Catholic churches that every single thing you do echoes. Like even like tapping your toe would echo throughout the whole place. Of all billions of dollars of marble type of setup, and they were going into the tabernacle and putting the Eucharist and wine that wasn't used back in, and my sister at the top of her lungs screams, "Mom, why are they putting God in the microwave?" And then I started cracking up, and my mom basically just scattered us, kind of like got us out of the church as she was trying to hold back the laughter.
I, of course, love the fact that the priests claim that they create miracles every Eucharist that exceeds the miracles of Jesus, because they literally turn the grape juice into wine and then into the blood of Jesus. And the first thing, of course, you say is, why don't we run a test on that? Why don't we run a test on that? I'd like to know if it's A, B, I mean, what is it? What blood type is it? I'm just curious as to what blood type old Jesus was. Yeah, can you run it, or are we going to
bad thing?
Are we just going to have the blood type here is grape? just you claim it's a miracle, man. Let's prove it. Or can you tell me where in the Torah it says that you should be drinking blood?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. I always thought, why is cannibalism something that we're actually? Because I do recall having a conversation.
Eating the body.
Do you really think it's literally, blood? Is it
flesh.
just supposed
to
be a metaphor? And
broken for you.
And And some of the answers I got were yes. A lot of the people said, no, it's really symbolic. I said, well, no, they're not treating it that way. Aren't there, if they're treating it like, it's to be revered and, socked away in the little microwave, as my sister called it, and, everything preserved, and because it now was the blood and the body after they did the special clanging of the bell and the waving of the hands. And I did get a lot of answers where, yes, this is actually blood and flesh. I said, isn't that actually spelled out as something not to do, is eat human blood and flesh?
Yeah.
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 Yeah, but they have the authority to change anything. The Eucharist was a pagan festival, and so they just did it. And of course, what they're doing when they do it is they're creating a counterfeit for Passover. So they're assuring that none of their constituents will ever benefit from Passover or unyeasted bread, because they have their Eucharist, which is a counterfeit of them. So there's not a single Catholic that's ever going to answer the invitation to participate in Passover and unyeasted bread. And if you don't avail yourself of those two mikre, then you remain estranged from God, and you're going to die. It's the doorway to life and the means of perfection. And I can guarantee the religious ritual is not going to do anything for it. I don't care if you go every day.
Let me ask you all a question, man.
Yeah.
How did they get Peter to be the first pope when he was so opposed to Shaul? Why did they keep him as the first pope?
Oh, because the whole thing. No, because
I know where it started
in three. Part, no, this is what happened in 325 CE. That the line that established the Roman Catholic Church, the line that every Roman Catholic will begin with, is yes, upon this rock I will build my church. And the rock is supposed to be Peter. Peter is the Greek word for Petrus, rock, and so they say, upon this rock, therefore Peter, I'm going to build my church. Now, the fact is that God never said anything like that. Yeshua never said anything like that. The line doesn't exist in any pre-Constantine manuscript. The fact the line isn't even in any manuscript prior to the 8th century. With the exception of the Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, and those two manuscripts, both of which were penned under the auspices of Eusebius, have thousands and thousands of overwrites and edits. I mean, one of them, the entire thing was just blanked out and written over, and like 5 centuries later. And so it's the only attribution to it, and that was in the 4th century. And those there's a reason that Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are seldom exposed for scholastic research, is that when they are, they're a laughingstock.
Yes.
So the line was never uttered. Had the line been uttered, it would have been to Shimon, listen to him, and it would have said, upon this, which is this rock, which would have been Sur. Sur is used throughout the Torah, prophets, and Psalms to speak about, it's just something that is solid. We talk about God does not have an eraser. When he etches something in stone, when he says something, it's solid, it's reliable. It's like you were carving it in stone. And so the reference is all the time to Sur, that Yahweh is my rock, the one I can really depend on. And so upon this rock I will build, which is Bana. Bana means to establish for the family. It's the feminine version of ben, which is son.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually not the Hebrew word for daughter, but it means to build on the family, to build on the family name, and to reestablish the family. I will build my, and then the word in Greek was ecclesia. Now, Yosha didn't speak Greek; he spoke Hebrew. So there's only one Hebrew term that can be translated ecclesia, which means to call out. It's the title of the mikre, which means invitations to be called out. And so upon this rock I will build for my family name the mikre. Now, and while that is easy to bring back into Hebrew and then to translate it correctly, based upon the historical record and the manuscripts, it was never stated. But it's the inclusion of that line, the misappropriation of the line to rock and to Peter and to this mythos that Jesus was the Messiah, therefore the Christ, which is just flat out untrue. And it's interesting, of course, that the Christian Jesus, Yosha, never once refers to himself as the Messiah. The only place where that it's even acknowledged that it might be valid is in this brief statement with Shimon, and in this brief statement, this conversation never took place. There's no record of this conversation prior to the 4th century. And so that's it. It's like, Christians say, well, he's the Son of God. I said, well, why doesn't he say so? Because he never says so.
Yeah.
He calls himself the Son of Man. Because that was what was unique about him from his perspective. He never calls himself the Son of God. Because the Son of God is Dowd, and the Messiah is Dowd, and he's not going to take those titles away from the person that God gave them to.
Hardly.
So long story short, to answer your question, because of this statement that was alleged to Jesus about building the church, therefore they assume that then Peter had to be the first pope, because you have their Jesus saying, yeah, hey, dude, you're right, and upon you, I'm going to build my church, so you had to be the first pope.
So Yoel, if he goes back to his old priest, he could ask him, why is the first pope Hebrew? I don't think that you'll do any better on that debate either.
No, I don't think they do any.
I'm sorry.
Any better. But
never mind.
But that is part of the problem all the way through. Every time you look at anything that is necessary to validate the Christian religion, it just turns to mush. And of course, when you talk to a Christian about prophecies, they'll say, well, there's thousands of prophecies that point to Jesus. Okay, well, every prophecy that God gives, he ascribes a name. There's not a single one he ascribes to Jesus, but let's just pretend that he had a senior moment. I mean, God's old. He's entitled to a senior moment that he just couldn't remember. He couldn't remember that name. I mean, of all the names, that name.
It just slips his mind.
Okay.
Slips his mind.
God, the best thing I can do is remember my own name. How am I supposed to remember a name that's based on my name? Okay, so he had a senior moment. He didn't remember the name. And so what they claim, because there's around 1,000 prophecies about David. And so every time there's a prophecy about David, like Dowd is the one who's coming back. There's the second coming, all right? It happens to be Dowd. There is a resurrection, although it's not bodily, and it's of Dowd. There is a King of Kings. It just happens to be Dowd. There really is a Messiah. It just happens to be Dowd. There's one person that God said, he is my son and I am his father. Just happens to be Dowd. And every time God makes these statements, he actually uses Dowd's name. So that puts the Christian transfer, replacement theology, in an even more difficult position, because now it's not just that God forgot the name of Jesus and never mentions it. Every time he means to speak of him, he slips up and calls him Dowd.
And
that's
then
like
that's like
if you're dating Terry, and all of a sudden, Kirk, that the only name that you can remember is whoever you dated
Sally,
before.
I'm in trouble.
Yes. Yeah. That is just not going to work. So.
Yeah, not
you will probably say whoever it was you dated before Mary, just because you're an irascible son of a gun, and you would think it's funny, right?
There was actually an old college joke about that where I had dated the 3 different women in a short period that all had the same first name. I said, I'm just trying to keep it easy on myself.
Yes.
The only criterion I'm using is do you have the same name? Then I'm golden after that point.
Yeah. I had an advantage when I was separated and started dating. Three girlfriends I was dating at the same time all had the same first name.
Oh my gosh!
Wow.
Okay, you win.
It does happen. But I know when you're dating like that, what you really have to do is you have to be on your toes because it is pretty easy to slip up. But, we're human. It can be expected of us. We are scallywags. And that is
down
not
south
true.
We call everybody sugar. That's all.
Okay, we'll see that works.
Hey, sugar.
All right. Now, before we get silly. Okay, so just to have a little bit of review where we were a week ago. What you've got is this book of Matthew. And the reason we're focusing on Matthew is because without Matthew, you can't justify replacement theology. Well, Paul begins replacement theology by taking the promises that were made to Dowd and giving it to his Jesus. And then he comes up with this myth that because Jews plotted to kill Jesus, that God got so pissed at them that he said, then you don't deserve salvation anymore, and that every promise I made to you, I'm now giving to the Gentiles. Now, there's a couple of problems with that. One of the problems is that you can't kill God. The second problem is that last time I checked, crucifixion is a Roman contrivance, and
distinctly
Rome crucified he wasn't stoned, he was crucified, which means that Rome did it, and therefore if God's going to be pissed off at somebody, it would be the Romans, and of course Rome is the basis of the Roman Catholic Church. So there are some rational flaws in that argument. My favorite rational flaw in that argument is...
And I just want to say glaring, though. They're not like little nuances that someone that researches as much as you do, Craig. I mean, that's glaring.
That's glaring. Those are
in your face, yeah.
Yeah, and when we celebrate Passover, and this clearly took place on Passover, well, what is the fate of the Passover lamb?
It needs to be killed.
Yeah, the Passover lamb dies, doesn't it? Is there any situation in Passover where the lamb says, no, not this time, nah, I'm going to kill one of you instead?
Never.
No. So if the Passover lamb has to be sacrificed for Passover, does it really matter who kills him?
No, whether it's in the home and the father of the house or
no. Matter of fact, if the Jews convince the Romans to kill the Passover lamb, shouldn't we be thanking the Jews?
That's a good thing.
Right.
Shouldn't we be celebrating? Shouldn't the Roman Catholic be saying, "Oh, Jews, thank you. Without you having served up the Passover lamb, we wouldn't have the benefit of eternal life." That's pretty glaring too. But this idea of the resurrection. Can you share with me an incident in the Torah, Prophets, and Psalms? Because he's celebrating Passover, so clearly he's the Passover lamb, where the Passover lamb, after it's been butchered, barbecued, consumed, that the Passover lamb comes back to life. Is the purpose of Passover eternal life for the Lamb?
Absolutely
No.
not.
It's the bill.
I didn't
being
think
paid.
the Passover was about
Fine.
the Lamb living forever.
Yep. That's why I was always kind of so standoffish with the New Testament, which was, the whole story is someone had to pay the fine, and
right.
God, set up the situation where the fine could get paid. Everything
right.
else are just, here's potentially, good, kind of interpretations of what was in the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, as far as a person that was following them correctly or following them well, or validating certain aspects. But I said, there's nothing new there. Why potentially read something that's corrupt and it's unreliable when you already know what the story is? You
right.
already know what the message is. So that's why I just always blew it off. Because there's going to be nothing new in there.
Well, we're going to go through why it is worse than untrue. There is something worse than unreliable. There really is something worse than unreliable. When testimony becomes the antithesis of what's true and people believe it en masse, then that's worse than just having something that's unreliable. And that is the basis of Matthew, which is why we have to review it. The worst conspiracy in human history is blame the Jews. And the blame the Jews conspiracy was born out of Paul's poison pen. So it all goes to this. So there is a reason that we're going to expose and condemn not only the book of Matthew, but the entirety of the Christian New Testament. And one of the things that many of those who've listened to the program know well is that when a Christian says, I'm holding up this an inerrant word of God, well, there's a couple of problems with that. We'd say, what version? And of course, then, there's 20 different translations. And I said, so which one of those is the inerrant one? Okay. Now, let's go a step beyond that. From what text was it translated? Because there are over 300,000 known variants between the text that the translations are claimed to be based on and the actual, the oldest manuscripts. In fact, the oldest manuscripts, the pre-Constantine manuscripts, differ markedly between them. So if you can't find even two manuscripts that agree, and that they all are variations and have contradictions and alterations, then not only can it be the inerrant word of God, it's a rational impossibility. It means one of two things. Either God had no capacity whatsoever to maintain his testimony in a way that was credible enough for us to learn from it and rely on it, or he had no intent of doing so. One of the two. Take your pick, because the history of the Christian New Testament is stunning. As a matter of fact, when Philip Comfort wrote, or compiled really, his book on the oldest manuscripts of the Christian New Testament, and he has pictures and long analysis of the 69 pre-Constantine manuscripts. And he writes right in the preface, says, I stopped at 325 CE. I have no manuscript after 325 CE because there's no point. And the reason there's no point is that even though these manuscripts differ markedly from one another, once you get to the point of Constantine and now you've got an authorized church, there is no commonality between the manuscripts. They vary so widely as to make this whole process of looking for the oldest text an utter waste of time. Yeah, what you do by comparing a post-Constantine and a pre-Constantine manuscript is prove that the Roman Catholic Church would say anything to empower themselves and absolutely cannot be trusted. So that's the reality. That it's not subject for debate. That's not subject to interpretation. That's not my interpretation. Those are the facts. The Christian New Testament is completely unreliable in terms of its compilation and its maintenance over these years. But it's worse than that. And that's because most of it was contrived by the church to perpetrate the greatest conspiracy of all time. The most lethal conspiracy of all time is that, which says in essence, that every promise that God made to Dowd David really applies to this Jesus that we've modeled after Dionysus, because without those promises, he has no credibility. Without those promises, he's not the Messiah. Without those promises, he's not the Son of God. Without those promises, there isn't a single prediction about him. So he can't be important to our religion unless we take all the 1,000 promises made to Dowd and just automatically transfer them. And we can't be relevant unless all of the promises that God made to the Jews over all this period of time really apply to us and have been transferred to us. And nothing can be valid unless Israel is really a pseudonym for church. And then when you realize that without all of that transfer, that there's a transfer that the Torah now has been replaced by the Christian New Testament. And you go all the way through with all of these replacements, no one bothers to go back and say, wait time out. So you're telling me that your God made all of these promises, thousands of them, to David, to Jews, to Israel, and regarding his Torah, and that every one of them he's welched upon, and is not going to honor them for the people and purpose that he issued them, and he's transferred them all to another group of people. Why would you trust him?
Exactly.
If you can't trust him then, why would you trust him now? And perhaps maybe you could just tell me, let's just put the idea of credibility and dependability and truth aside for a moment. Since you're claiming that all of the predictions about the Jews were transferred to you, why isn't there a single prophecy where God says, I'm going to replace them with you? Or maybe this one. Since the number one theme, the number one prophetic theme, overwhelmingly, number one prophetic theme, what do you think it is? Throughout the prophets, throughout the Torah, the prophets, and so on, all the way beginning with the conversations with Abraham, what do you think the single most reoccurring prophetic theme?
Reconciling Israel to him.
Yeah, reconciling the chosen people, Yisrael and Yahudah, into the covenant and with Yahweh. Number one, bringing his people back home. That's why the book's called Coming Home in our time. Bringing his people back home and reconciling his relationship, restoring his relationship with his people. It's overwhelmingly the most common prophecy. If the Jews had been replaced with Christians, if Israel had been replaced by the church, then can you tell me why every end-time prophecy, thousands of them, Yahweh refers to the ones that he's fulfilling it with is Israel, Yahudem, and never once a Christian, a church, or a goy? Never once. 1,000 times he says, I'm going to do this in the last days. I'm going to do this in Israel, in Jerusalem, on behalf of Israelites
Israel and Judah
and Yehudim. So how is it possible then you want me to believe that God has 2,000 years ago reneged on all those promises and gave it to another group of people?
That'd be insane.
Would you call that one glaring? Yeah, well, I'm just trying to, score some points here. Would that be a 3-pointer?
with a chance for a 4-point on the foul shot.
4-point play.
I would think so.
A foul shot. Right.
Yeah. I mean, we have to laugh because the basis of Christianity is so utterly stupid.
Started with something I think you pointed out many years ago, which was some of the best research into the inconsistencies in all of the translations and all the what do you call permutations of the New Testament was done by the Catholic Church when they were essentially saw themselves losing control over being the only ones who could read and dole out the Latin version or interpretation. And when the Greek and the English and the Spanish and the Hebrew translations were all coming out, they were doing the research to show how inconsistent and unreliable all of that was, so that they were hoping to hold on to their power grab. So ironically, a lot of the research we ran across a couple decades ago, almost at this point, was done by people in the Vatican or other places that were basically trying to undermine fellow quote-unquote Christians to retain more of their hold over the flock.
Yeah. Well, in fact, when and I think it's in like chapter 10, something like that, of volume 1 of Observations for Our Time. And we've gone through this on this program where we actually talk about how the Christian New Testament actually came into fruition, and what Jerome wrote the Pope at the time, telling Damascus, telling him that, Pope, we have a real problem here. And the problem is that any time somebody brings up an argument and we try to defend the argument with our scripture, the person bringing the argument says, well, which version are you quoting? Which variation are you claiming is true? Because he said there are more variations than we can possibly deal with. And there's so many just senseless scribal errors and copy edits that there isn't a credible way to answer that question. So, dear Pope, I have a solution for you. What I think we ought to do is create one that we'll call the authorized and perfect Latin translation out of all of these variant Greek texts. And at this point, the Greek text of the Septuagint was so divergent. Each text were so different from one another that Origen spent his entire life just trying to say, all right, here's how they all differ. Let's just try to synthesize maybe a common ground through these things. And Jerome wasn't even dealing with that. He was dealing with the old Latin copies of it. So now we're 2 languages away, and he then just did a synthesis of those and said, this is the reading that I like here, this is the reading I like there, I'll take this one here, I'll take this one there, and when I'm done, we'll destroy all of the old ones. We'll destroy them all, and we'll say, this is it, this is the one. That's the same thing happened with the Quran. There were all of these various readings, but with various readings, you can't be an authoritative dictatorial regime claiming that you have God's authority. So what do? They come up with their variation that they accept, and everything else is destroyed. That's what they did. And Jerome admits to it.
Yep.
So, they have their own legacy of admitting that they committed this crime. And then when Wycliffe had the audacity to say, well, this the Catholic Church is claiming all of this stuff, but they're only claiming it in Latin, which of course is the language of Rome. So We're proving that the Roman Catholic Church is just an evolution out of Imperial Rome. And nobody speaks Latin. So they're giving their sermons in Latin. Not a person in the audience understands Latin. Don't you think we ought to be able to give people the opportunity to read this for themselves? And so he went into the Latin text and he translated the Latin into a precursor to English called Anglo-Saxon. And you know what they did? The Roman Catholic Church burned every copy. They hunted him down. They cut him into little pieces.
They didn't get rid of him until he was already dead, though. That's one of my favorite Catholic stories. Is they hunted him his whole life. He escaped them, but then they found his buried body and said, "Aha!
Yeah, they dug him up.
We'll get you."
Wycliffe.
Chop you in pieces and bury you around the whole country. Which in and of itself is telling. Not only does it show like just a weird, wacky pettiness and disgusting kind of mentality, but it also shows a little bit of their hand as far as the kind of pagan, mythos of, your body being separated into little pieces had some kind of effect on you in the afterlife type of scenario as well. So
you have a degree in engineering. I realize it's not in biology, but could you explain to me how it's possible for a body to be physically resurrected?
It's obviously not.
It's just not possible.
The one thing I think that we talked about that was intriguing is the whole notion that there is no matter. Basically, when we talk about maybe the last millennium of this time, so to speak, being the transfer of the soul or the spirits as energy into something that's mass-like. But you're talking about a whole level of existence that we're not playing with at this era at all.
No. One of the things that became obvious as we were studying Yahowah is the realization that Yahowah has to be at least one dimension greater than the universe he created. So we know for certain that our universe is at least four-dimensional. So he has to be at least five. Now, I have surmised from everything that he has said that because the universe, 95% of the universe, which we know to be four-dimensional and we can quantify as four-dimensional, that only comprises 5% of the universe. 95% of the universe is comprised of what we call dark matter and dark energy, which are things that are not only unknown to us, that's why we call them dark, they're beyond our capacity to know. And the issue there is that while we can mathematically calculate the implications of a four-dimensional universe, as three-dimensional beings, we can't envision it. We have no idea what it would be like to exist in four dimensions. And I saw a video on it the other day on what it would really be to be a being to go into four dimensions. And one of the first things they said is that the energy threshold is such that a physical body trying to make that threshold into four dimensions would be incinerated. That in full four dimensions, that hydrogen becomes so unstable that water evaporates. We're going to get really thirsty. The noise level, because of the energy in four dimensions, would be excruciating to us. But the most fundamental thing, like I'm sitting in a room, to get out of this chair and to walk out the door, the calculations required to do that in four dimensions is just infinitely beyond our ability to think. And that's going from 3.5 dimensions, kind of where we are right now, just to fully four. It's beyond our capacity to even process, and completely incompatible with a three-dimensional object. So how in the world do you go from 4 to 5 if God's not going to do something extraordinary for us in terms of enlightening us and empowering us and enriching us? We couldn't make that transition. And And then this whole notion, because I got to this on a bodily resurrection, a body is the very thing that's precluding us from having this capacity. So long as we're physical,
right.
we cannot be immortal. So long as we're physical, we're degrading, so we can't be perfect. So long as we're physical, we're trapped in a three-dimensional world. This whole universe and the enormous side of it, waste of time, because we can't leave the planet. Now, we can go to the moon, but that's about as far as we can go. So
yeah, it's interesting too to think of the way to appreciate, because we actually were talking the other night, Craig, about this, and something along the lines, and it's not something that really needs to be split or parsed, but you're mentioning something about the power of being able to handle things at the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh dimension is just and it's one of those things that I occasionally kind of like parse words a bit because I think of the advent here that we're experiencing in quantum computing, and it's what quantum computers aren't more powerful than your binary computers at all. In fact, in many cases, they're a heck of a lot less capable as far as processing. But what they're doing is they're looking at things in such a different way, just turning all of our kind of way we think of things logically or methodically or whatever, putting it on its head, that it's able to look at a problem and solve it in an instant. Not because it's being more powerful, it's just more aware or more capable of thinking in, an extra dimension, so to speak. And, to me, that's just a minor glimpse of what you're kind of alluding to, which is, going to from our three-dimensional or 3.5-dimensional space to many more.
Yes. And to have freedom and operate in them. And one of the reasons that I take a very controversial point of view, because you were talking about a new covenant and an old covenant, and of course those terms are not Yahweh's terms. He only has one covenant, but he is going to renew and restore his covenant relationship with Yahudah and Yisrael. And when he does, he is actually placing a copy of his Torah instructions inside of us. And there are lots of arguments in favor of there's only one Torah, so he's just taking the Torah as it exists and putting it inside of us. And I'm saying, no, he's not.
No,
and the reason I'm saying no, he's not, is because, I don't know if it's somewhere between 60 to 80% of the existing Torah would have absolutely no value to us. And a lot of it would be counterproductive. And I say that because I don't need to know at that point that the Egyptians were stupid. I don't need to know that at that point that the Israelites, when they came back, started worshiping the Egyptian gods again. What's the point? I don't need to know that God was so frustrated with the first men and women with an asalma that he needed to do a reboot in the area around the Black Sea. The stupidity of mankind and propensity to be vicious and religious is not something that would bring any pleasure. It would be, here we know Yahweh personally. We're enjoying his company, and to think of how stupid man was to forego that. So that's not useful. The means to engage in the covenant relationship, to leave religion and politics. Well, why do I need to know that? Because at this point there is no religion and politics. There isn't any to leave. Why do I need an instruction that says, and walk to God and become perfect? Walk to Yahweh and become perfect. I've already got the full benefit of matzah. What's the purpose in a dietary instruction of that's good to eat and that's not good to eat when you're an energy-based being? I mean, what good is the instruction that says that about the timing of the Moed Mikre, which is based upon the lunar cycle superimposed within the solar year, when in eternity there's not going to be a planet Earth or a moon? Oh, no moon phase.
Right.
Well, what good would that be? Right? So the majority of what's in there is not going to be of any use to us. And if you view Torah as God's instruction and teaching that permeates the Psalms and the prophets, the same thing would be true, but even to a greater degree. But now, think about just going from 3 dimensions to 4, and the guidance that you're going to need to not only get the most enjoyment out of it, but just to be effective and experiencing it, and not doing anything that is stupid. Like, you may not want to go out there and play with the black hole. It's a really bad idea. Stay away from the black hole. If you're going to create, a platypus, here's some rules, because we don't want to create a whole lot of pain and have a mess. So there are some things that you audit. I'm looking for some instructions from the creator of the universe as to how to have a really good time without screwing things up. I don't want to put myself in harm's way. I don't want to put other people in harm's way. I want to know how close I can get. The black hole might be interesting one day, but I want to know how close I can get without having a problem. And I would really like to know, because I think life's really cool, and it might be fun to go to a planet, and you've got this alphabet, this code. It's a 3-dimensional code called DNA. Wouldn't you like to know how to manipulate it to outdo the platypus? I want an aardvark with wings.
Really?
Right?
Who doesn't?
Okay.
Yeah. Who doesn't? Someplace there really ought to be a unicorn that shoots glitter. I mean, there's just a need for one of these. So, there are things. And so I would like to. Yes.
I was just going to say, you're just describing eternity with God as some weird version of Pokemon Go, is all it sounds like to me.
I think it'd be fun to have a little creative opportunity.
License, yeah.
Yeah, a little. Yeah, I mean, I didn't get to see the dinosaurs. I think it'd be fun to create a dinosaur, right? But who knows? Maybe we won't have that opportunity. But there's just some fun things that I think would be cool to do. But maybe I'll be out there all by myself and say, "Hey, man, he's dangerous. He's really wacko. You may want to stay away from him. He is the problem child up here. Who let him in?" I was carrying the Torah. We couldn't turn him down, but you're right. He's really weird. All right. Well, the reality is that by the time that the book of that's now called the Gospel of Matthew, by the time that it came into being, the book of Mark was well distributed. The book of Luke was well distributed, so its author could plagiarize them, and did 80% of his book. And Paul's epistles, P46, for example, dates to the early 2nd century. So we know that Paul's letters were well distributed, and that the person who scribed the book of Matthew was a Pauline aficionado. All there. So Luke was the beloved physician of Paul. I personally think that he was Paul's frustrated exorcist, but that's just me. He needed one, that's for darn sure. But written, around 90 CE. Now, the biggest issue with Matthew is this transition. If you look at Yehudim, they're called Yisraelites by the compiler of this book. And they only become Yahudai, Jews, after their rejection of the Christian Christ. So they're showing not only rejecting the Christian Christ, but in Matthew, we got the protocols of the elders of Zion. They're plotting against him. They're plotting with the Romans. They're plotting with themselves. They're plotting with everybody to not only kill him, but to hide his body, to do everything imaginable. It's a conspiracy. Now, I am guilty of making a lot of mistakes. One of my greatest mistakes is that for the longest time, I viewed the book of Matthew as one of the eyewitness accounts, and I would translate out of it and share things out of it because, well, quite frankly, I thought that the Sermon on the Mount was a credible presentation. And I tried not to go too far beyond that, but Sermon on the Mount, which is only in the book of Matthew, is credible from my point of view. And the reason I viewed it as credible is that it is 100% consistent with the Torah, and in it, the text of it is so anti-Christian, it is so destructive to the religion of Christianity, that there just wasn't any chance that it could have been created later by a Christian, because it would be like you answering the priest saying, "No, I'm not buying that he's my Lord and Savior," because that's essentially. It essentially says the Torah stands, every letter in the Torah, every part of every letter in the Torah stands so long as the heavens and earth exist, and do not think that I came to do away, that I came to fulfill it. So you're pretty much screwed, blued, and tattooed as it relates to a Christian New Testament. So I thought it was true. That was my defense. And I'm not completely wrong in that regard, because there is sound justification to conclude that Yosha told the disciple Levi, about his encounter with Yahuwah in the Jordan and with Satan in the wilderness, and that those stories were incorporated into the Gospel's 3rd and 4th chapters. And there's every reason to conclude that as a witness to the Sermon on the Mount, the disciple Levi transcribed what he heard, composing what is found now in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Now, the reason that this rings true is because there is credible extant evidence showing that the earliest followers of Yosha were Torah-observant Yahudim who had read what Levi had written in a book called According to Hebrew. And they read nothing else apart from the Torah and prophets. Lots of affirmation. In 140 CE, Appius wrote that the book his fellow Christians referred to as Matthew was compiled based upon the sayings of Jesus in Hebrew. In addition, Irenaeus wrote, they use Matthew only, and they repudiate the Apostle Paul, maintaining that he was an apostate from the Torah. Now, if Irenaeus is right, we already have our answer. Mm-hmm. The Talmud even admits to burning, this is now the religious Jews, they admit to burning early Hebrew accounts pertaining to Yosha's testimony. The lone candidate would have been Levi's According to Hebrew, now mislabeled the Gospel of Matthew. Even Jerome, the author of the Vulgate, we mentioned him before, admits to receiving a truncated copy of this book written in Hebrew, which he said was prepared for him by a Jewish acquaintance near Antioch. And the fragmentary evidence that is preserved in his notes, which is known simply as According to Hebrew or just Hebrew, was attributed to the disciple and contained the prophetic testimony according to Yosha's birth, while excluding the genealogy now found in the Gospel of Matthew. The Hebrew text chronicled Yosha's experience in the Jordan River. and his temptation before Hasatan in the wilderness. It included a limited collection of Yahushua's most important sayings, most specifically his Sermon on the Mount, which is found nowhere else in the Christian New Testament. Imagine that. It's the single most important speech he ever made. The longest speech, his initial declaration of this is what my entire purpose and life is going to be about. And it's only recorded in the one book. Yeah. That's a problem for Christianity, because his most important speech, of course, completely destroys the credibility of their religion.
Blessed
Hebrew
are the
addressed
cheesemakers.
Yeah, blessed be the cheesemakers. Hebrew addressed his transformation along with his celebration of Pesach with his disciples before actually fulfilling Passover. It even covered Yahushua's first appearance, which, guess what, was to his brother Jacob. Yeah. And that's the thing that pissed old Jerome off, because in Roman Catholicism, Mary has to be a perpetual virgin. And so Yahushua can't have a brother if Mary remained a perpetual virgin. So he curses according to Hebrew, because he says that it has the dreaded reference to Jacob, and that therefore cannot be true. Now, based upon what was quoted from according to Hebrew, it's worth noting and reiterating that this eyewitness account concludes with Yahushua's first post-Bokurim appearance, which was to his brother and the disciple Jacob, affirming that he made his sacrifice for his people. Speaking of Jacob and Jerome, commentary on Ezekiel 6, in reference to Hebrew, he would lament on behalf of the Roman Catholic insistence that Mary was a perpetual virgin. There is counted among that book the most grievous offenses. He that has grieved the spirit of his brother. As we might expect, Hebrew presents Jacob, Yehudim, and Yisrael as brothers, and the Torah favorably. Affirming yeah, of course, yeah, that's because the Hebrew actually chronicled Yahushua's sayings, and he thought favorably of Jacob, of Yehudim, and of Yisrael, and of course was the living embodiment of the Torah. Affirming the existence of the Hebrew eyewitness text, Clement, Origen, and Didymus all cite from us, as did the aforementioned Jerome. They all admit that according to Hebrew was used as a proof text to supplement what is now called the Gospel of Matthew. Eusebius, the most villainous man in the entire episode as it relates to the creation of the book of Matthew, included a reference to it in his list of disputed writings, noting that it was used by the Hebrews. He was an anti-Semite. Sadly, he wouldn't have liked you very much, Joe, even though, he wouldn't like me very much either. Kirk, maybe. Kirk's a pretty likable guy. Sadly, shamefully,
I'll open my mouth.
Yeah. As a result, Eusebius and the Roman Catholic Church, indeed, because of their utter disdain for all things Jewish, the codexes of Hebrew were obliterated by the church. And that was done when the church canon was codified in the 4th century. According to Hebrew, was deemed heretical and destroyed. The Roman Catholic Church views Hebrew and Greek as the two criminals that were hanging on crosses next to Jesus, and Jesus, of course, is Latin. So Latin is God, and the two criminals are Hebrew and Greek. Yes. Okay.
Surrounded by two thieves was a quote or whatever.
Yeah, there you go. So we're gonna Latin. Latin is God's language. Yeah. As a matter of fact, it's the challenge, of course, of that is what empire did Yahweh gets this history of the great beasts to plague humankind. It started with Babylon, then it went to Media Persia, which evolved out of Babylon and destroyed Babylon, and then Media Persia was destroyed by Alexander the Great, and so that's how it evolved from there. And then it says that Rome became the most vicious of all beasts, and it conquered Greece. Now, of course, this was written before even Greece existed, and Media Persia didn't even exist at the time the prophecy was written. But nonetheless, we give God some credit. He was a really good guesser. And he labeled Rome as the most vicious beast that would ever live, and then say that evolving out of Rome would be the beast that treads upon the whole world. So we definitely have a breakdown now in what Roman Catholicism could possibly represent, what is indeed heretical. So even the Roman Catholic Church admits that Christian antiquity is unanimous in maintaining that St. Matthew wrote a gospel in Hebrew. Actually, it was Lowy. The testimony of Papias, St. Irenaeus, Pantheus, Origen, Eusebius, Jerome, and many others all bear out this statement. Now, that was from eCatholic 2000, Catholics Online for the Third Reich. For the millennium. Okay. Most people don't have any appreciation for why Hitler called the Nazis the Third Reich. I mean, it's so damn obvious. He explained it. The First Reich was Imperial Rome. Second Reich was the Roman Catholic Church. His Nazi movement was the Third Reich, evolving right out of Roman Catholicism. Thank you very much. There's a real light. The people who were responsible for drawing our attention to, according to Hebrew, referenced or referred to themselves as Ebonim. Ever heard of that term, Ebonim?
Sounds familiar.
A lot of time people tell me they want to know, what was the behavior like? What was the testimony like of the first to be followers of the way? I said, well, if you want to know, study the Ebonim. Yeah. Their name is based upon the Hebrew word. By the way, I see this Hebrew word all through the prophets. Ebonim. Which was spoken by Yosha to describe those who had been oppressed and abused and were in need of deliverance, who will, in fact, inherit the earth. Ebonim. At the commencement of the Sermon on the Mount, that's what he said. Prophetic. The lives of those mistakenly called Ebonites was scandalously recorded by Irenaeus in his Adverse Heresies, Origen and Contra Coelesum, Eusebius and Ecclesiastical History, Hippolytus and Fetio Haresium, even by Jerome in his commentary on Matthew. The Roman Catholic Church universally despised them to the same extent and reason that Paul loathed Torah-observant Yehudim, who recognized and followed Yosha. He sought to kill them. That was his self-proclaimed occupation at the time that the zippy spirit on the road to Damascus made him lame and blinded him, is he was out torturing and killing Ebonim. And he would continue to do so. The justification for all of this decidedly negative attention is that the Ebonim universally rejected Paul. They celebrated the Mikra. They were part of the Bereth covenant. They observed the Shabbat. To these church fathers, they were Judaizers and this heretics. Hey, so Yoel, you told the Pope to take a long walk on a short plank, and you weren't going to buy into his faith, which is kind of an interesting. And probably even at your age, you ought to have been able to say, your church has been around for a couple of thousand years. Why are you still asking me to believe? After all this time, is there not enough proof to know?
Well, I kind of lied at the whole base of, I think, a lot of people, which is why does it take so much quote unquote faith? Why isn't it made more obvious? And it's because it's obvious if it hasn't been obfuscated for thousands of years by religion.
And that, by the way, is my biggest issue, Yoel, with Christianity, is why would anyone want to believe this pile of lies when the truth is so irrefutable, so clearly presented, so rationally undeniable, when the truth is spectacular, when the truth is presents God exactly as you would want him to be? Well, when with the evidence God absolutely proves his existence, no faith required. You can know him, you can understand him, you can prove his existence and prove that he inspired the Torah, prophets, and Psalms. Why would you choose to believe? What's the point when you can know?
All right.
And that's my biggest issue with it. I think that was ultimately why you gave up being an atheist, is that the evidence that God presents on his behalf is so overwhelming and so irrefutable and so desirable that you say, I'm not going to argue with that, please.
Well, I think the big one for me is, we talked about this, but it's been years now, so I might as well repeat it. But we would have discussions when you were doing your research, especially at the beginning in Islam and such. And we would migrate into Christianity, Judaism, etc. And even though I couldn't, counter a lot of the points you were making, I always fell back on the same thing I said to the priest, or one of the things I said, which is, I don't care how many things you say or do or whatever, but some greater being that says, do all this stuff I tell you to do, or I'm going to torture you forever. It's been in my nature forever to say, well, you're not going to force me to do anything. That's not love. Like, go pound sand. I don't care if you promise me all this other stuff. Like, that's not the way I respond to anything. Right. Is being told and demanded that I do something.
Yeah, don't boss me around, and don't, by God, tell me that if I don't obey your orders, that you're going to torture me forever, because that's not a God I want to know. That's like that Roman Catholic woman or man that says, no, if you're not a member of the church, we're going to make sure that your child goes to hell.
Yep.
Right.
And when you, of course, started to get into the first elaborations and translations and amplifications, and realize, hey, a lot of this that we just kind of attribute to being hell is really just annihilation and oblivion. Then all of a sudden, I said, okay, I'll start listening now. You've removed the enormous barrier. Now we can start talking about all these stupid little fairy tales, and see about whales eating people and the Earth being 6,000 years old. I'll start diving into it. But for me, the whole non-starter was, love me or I'll torture you forever. I just shut down after that.
Yeah, any rational person would know that a God who says, obey me or and love me or I'm going to see that you're tortured forever is not lovable. He would be sadistic. You do not want to be around such a being. And
you can't love
we actually
someone,
started
the
first right. The first translations were in the book of Hosea. And in the book of Hosea, it becomes overwhelmingly evident that there are three destinations for human souls, and that the vast preponderance of souls cease to exist. So you have the perfect and fair scenario. God presents information about who he is, what he is offering, and what he expects in return. If you like who he is, you respect and are interested in what he's offering, and you're willing to accept what he's asking in return, you get to go and spend eternity with him. Pretty good deal. I'd highly recommend it. if you live your life and you are fooled into believing, you place your faith in a fake God, you don't know the real one, you never bothered to hold your religion accountable, you just go through life, either you're an atheist, you're an agnostic, you are religious, you don't know God, God doesn't know you, well, that would be inappropriate to punish such a person. So God just simply says, I gave you your mortal life, I gave you free will, I gave you my instructions that you could have read, but you chose not to. So at the end of your life, your soul is simply going to cease to exist. No penalty, no torture. Fair.
Fair.
I don't know you, you don't
Totally
know me. But for me to be just, if you've been overtly religious, overtly militant, overtly political, and you, as a result, have deliberately led people away from me. You were an inquisitioner, torturing my people. You were a camp guard during the Holocaust. You were somebody who has, like Paul, has turned the world against my people. There has to be a consequence. And God said, yeah, there is one. It's called a black hole. I'm not going to torture you there. You just get to have a eternal timeout. And that timeout's going to be with a lot of other religious souls, and there'll be no escape.
Well, now we've had many discussions, on that too. And the bottom line is, well, we can only think about logically. We can't really say, who goes one door or the other for sure at all. But I think personally, in just an opinion, that even the torturers and that killed my relatives aren't necessarily in hell, because to me I think it's potentially a conscious choice. Meaning, if you, as far as your relationship with Yah, meaning if like priests, for example, they're in big trouble because they've done enough studying and they've looked into enough to know, and they're making a conscious choice to say, I know what you're asking of me and what my responsibilities are to the rest of the souls out there, but I am choosing to go away from you, in fact, to lead other people away because it's better for me right now.
Yeah.
Versus someone that's just a horrible, evil person isn't necessarily, I don't know if it's as much as punishment. I think it's really, hey, that was your choice. I'm not going to punish you or not. It's just you chose to come with me on the trip, and some chose not to.
Yep, I would agree with you to a point, but I would challenge two of your conclusions. And again, this is for discussion purposes. You could be perfectly right, and I could be wrong. But I would say there's two things that I would challenge on that. Is that to some degree we can know who is going to Shamayim, the spiritual realm, and who is going to Sheol, the black hole. And for example, we can be really sure that Muhammad and Akiba and Paul and popes are headed to Sheol. Yeah. They have to be, otherwise God's testimony would be unfulfilled. So they're headed to Sheol. What we can't tell is, you gave the example of the torturer, the person who had invented or applied the torture devices to Jews during the Inquisition, which lasted for centuries. Now, I happen to agree with you that there's the possibility that this person didn't actively choose to lead people astray, that they're just a really, really warped, disgusting human being. I think it is quite possible that, and I think it is likely, that one of the reasons that there is judgment is that those who were tortured, while they're not going to spend eternity in Shamayim because they don't know Yahweh and he didn't meet the conditions of the covenant, while they're not going to be in Shamayim, they deserve some degree of closure. They need to know that the person that tortured them in that cruel way is going to be held accountable. So I can see God holding the people accountable who tortured his people. and that those who were tortured would be awakened enough to know that those who tortured them are being held accountable.
Just desserts. Yeah.
Right, they get their just desserts. So I think there is a likelihood of that kind of payback, and that payback doesn't necessarily include an eternity in Sheol, but there still has to be payback, and there has to be closure for those who were tortured. Your great-grandparents and family deserve to know that the perpetrators of the Holocaust and those who tortured them in that way are being held accountable. I don't think God can be fair any other way. So I think there's that possibility, and there's a lot of statements that I've read that suggest that that's going to happen. It's not something I want to witness, not something I want to be around, but I do want for those the 6 million men, women, and children that were Jewish that were tortured and murdered in the Holocaust, I want them to have closure. I do. I think it's important for them to have closure. So that would be the only modifications. Yeah. Again, I just want God to be totally fair and a just judge.
Well, can I just throw one thing in also?
Sure.
It's hard for me to exclude the military. I mean, in Samuel, he says captains with 50 people and so forth. If you make a habit of killing and you really love this stuff, I mean,
yes.
Soldiers do. There are soldiers. They
Right.
they love to blow up stuff. They love to kill people. I mean, it's a rush.
Yeah.
Something is really sick in your soul, and the victims. I mean, spraying Agent Orange all over the place and just murdering, women and children and blowing up houses and stuff. That is beyond
Twisted.
my comprehension.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether it was directed directly at Jews or all of the cities in Tokyo, the city in Tokyo, and bombing those people to extinction almost. That's got to be some recourse for that. I mean,
but I'm going to take this middle ground between they're going to Sheol, which is, Sheol. I think to go into Sheol, you have to have made a conscious decision as a religious person that you know the truth, you've rejected the truth, and you have deliberately misled people away from God, and in the process, you have deliberately harmed the chosen people. Yeah. I think that's what gets you the ticket into Sheol of eternity in a black hole. And so the more I read here, the more I'm comfortable with those who have just been bloody thugs and tortured people this way or hunted them down to kill, that their victims will get some closure and they will be held accountable, but that accountability may not be an eternity in Sheol.
Well, you'd have to at least include then there's a certain group of politicians, political people that like the conspiracy between Hitler and the Catholic Church. I mean, that's politics and religious on steroids. I mean, that's
or the manifest destiny of politicians in America. That Andrew Jackson, for example, that thought it was just hunky dory to go hunt down and murder tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Native Americans.
Yeah, and that was after he used them to fight off the British.
Right.
This is really warped.
It's really warped. Yeah, that's. So I happen to agree. I think, but
I understand.
There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of real details here that we just don't need to know. It's fun it's not fun sometimes.
It's just a mental exercise for us to talk about, but I don't think it's really an important thing for us to worry about at all. And again, just like anything else in Scripture, there's not a lot about it because it's not a lot that we need to worry about.
Like there are things that we need to know. We need to know that there are three destinations for human souls because that is the number one reason that atheists are atheists. So it's important for us to know it, important for us to say it, and clearly. And it's important for us to say that hell is not a place of physical torture, that it's a place where where souls are incarcerated in a lightless place. God does not go there. There is no fires. There is no physical torture. It is just eternal separation from God. It's important to present it that way, and that the only way you get there is you deliberately lead people away and cause harm to His people. And by the way, you have a daughter. It's your job to protect your daughter. If a man came up and really tortured your daughter, did physical harm to your daughter, are you going to forgive them?
No.
Yeah, of course not. But
no, of course not.
I don't. I just don't subscribe. And again, I'm not saying you're right or wrong. It's just I personally don't subscribe, though, as far as the odd picture that there needs to be a closure or a punishment for those who are evil. Just as the kind of logical nerd that I am, it just fits fine with me to say that there's potentially even only a handful of people that go to Sheol, because there's only a handful that knew enough to truly know that they were going out of their way to lead people away from God. I've studied religions in too much detail, and history in too much detail, to know that it isn't a handful. It's quite a few. At least in the thousands. It could be in the millions that have punched their ticket. And when I say a handful, I'm kind of thinking of relative terms, meaning I think anyone that is heavily involved in religion knows at some point that they are. They've come across something that is incongruous, and the only way that they can, go forward is either quit everything they put their life behind and lose their credibility as far as their peers are concerned and their livelihood. But at least they'd be listening to God, and most, if not all, decide not to go with God. At that point, you're going straight. You've punched your ticket. Yep, you punch your ticket. And again, Yoel, it isn't useful for us to get into any significant detail as to what the threshold is. It's way above our pay grade. It's not something we need to know. It's a discussion, but it's not important. Correct. It is valuable for us to go after the worst of the worst. So, I'm going to go after Paul because Yahweh goes after Paul with all he has. I'm going to go after Paul. I'm going to go after Muhammad. I'm going to go after Akiva. I'm going to go after Hadrian, and I'm going to expose and condemn them, and I would love to participate in their trials and enjoy excoriating them. But beyond that, that's God's business. It's not mine. He needs to be fair. He's going to do the right thing. We don't need to know that, other than it's important for us to present as accurate a picture as we can. When it comes to how we become part of Yahweh's family, now that's a place where we need to get into detail. We need to be consistent. We need to be accurate. And we need to say there's 5 benefits to the covenant, there's 5 conditions to the covenant, and there is no access to God apart from the covenant. You have to walk away from religion and politics, from the family of man, if you're going to be part of the family of God. God's not going to allow you to bring religion and politics and militarism into His family, into His home. So that's the first thing you have to do. And once you have done that, then God says that He wants you to walk to Him and become perfect. So it's a walk away from one thing, the family of man, which is corrupting, and the second half of that is to walk to God and become perfect. It is very much like Pesach and matzah. Pesach without matzah is counterproductive. You're going to be eternal, but you're eternally estranged from God. So you need Pesach and matzah together. The same thing is true with the first 2 conditions. You need to walk away from the family of man, from religion and politics, and then walk to God and become perfect. So those 2 things go hand in hand. Then God says that He wants you to trust and rely upon Him. Well, the only way you can trust and rely on somebody is to ditch the faith and learn enough
that you can come to understand, because knowledge and understanding underpin trust and reliance. And then he says, I want you to closely examine and carefully consider the instructive terms of my relationship agreement, of my covenant. Well, that's the path. That's the very thing we're articulating right now. And then lastly, he says, as a sign of the covenant, I want you to circumcise your son. As parents, I want you to do this on behalf of your son, so that you remember and I remember that you're a people set apart and that you have committed to this relationship, and you're going to raise your children to become my children. Those are the 5 conditions of the covenant. And there are 5 benefits.
I'm still in the camp where I'm not on board with the 5th. That's where I'm standing still. So I'm fine with that. I'm fine with going up to Yah and saying, I'm sorry, just didn't believe it. Anything ceremonial, I'm just not on board with. Hope you're cool with it. That's the way you and I have been, going back and forth, Yah and you and me. And he'll say, yeah, you're always a stinker, you all.
Well, he's really clear on circumcision, that circumcision has to be both of the spirit and the flesh. So it is symbolic, hugely symbolic. But he says, if you're a man and you're not circumcised of the flesh, you're not coming into heaven. As a matter of fact, he says, if you're not circumcised of the flesh, don't participate in Passover, because you're not included in the covenant and it's counterproductive for you. I don't want you to take that risk. So it is one of those things which he has made really clear is it's both symbolic and physical. It's something that's, but he's saying, he doesn't say you have to do it. You don't have to obey him. It's just that if you want to be part of his family, this is your signature. And one of the things that's interesting about it, of course, if it's done correctly according to his instruction, it is a health benefit for our sons, and it is not a decision that our children is making. It's the decision of the parents to raise their children within the covenant, to teach their children about the covenant. So now that's the instruction that God gives on it. Now the 5 benefits are all derived through the first 4 mikra. That's why the first 4 mikra have been fulfilled. Eternal life, perfection, which is Pesach and Matzah, adoption into Yahweh's family, Bakodim, being empowered, enriched, and enlightened, which is Shabbat, the promise of 7. So those are the benefits. You like the benefits, then those are the conditions. Now, the good thing about the conditions is all the conditions are benefits. There isn't any one of the conditions of the covenant that is a burden. And every single one of them is offered under the auspices of free will. You can take it or leave it. Now, one of the things that I have found, too, is that it's very rare that somebody says, all right, I'm just going to pick up the Torah, I'm going to read this thing, and they said, all right, well, that makes sense, I'm going to accept the terms and conditions. I think almost all the time that someone becomes part of Yahweh's family, that somewhere along the line, as they were walking away from religion, beginning to question religion or being interested in who he is, that he reached out and made an introduction. Put somebody in your path, put something in your proximity, somehow reached out and began the relationship. You look at the most important person in human history, Dowd. He was out tending sheep in Bethlehem, and Yahweh said, "Bring that one to me. That's the one I want." Yahweh reached out to him. Moshe, he was out tending sheep in Arabia. God reached out to him and said, hey, I want you to go with me to get my people out of Egypt. And Moshe was the perfect choice because of what he was and what he was not. He was the only person that God didn't have to explain all the muck of religion and politics of Egypt as to why he wanted his people out of there. Moshe had lived there. He knew what was wrong about that economic scheme based on slavery. He knew what was wrong with the religion based upon a man God. He knew what was wrong with the militaristic nature of that people and how vicious they became. So God didn't have to explain it to him. He knew it. God doesn't want to have to explain to us what's wrong. He wants to take his time to explain what's right. So he likes to work with people that have had an exposure to that when they're playing the role that Moshe is in. But the second reason was God is so unpretentious that the perfect person for him to pick to waltz into the most powerful nation on earth and to free his people was a broken down, stuttering shepherd. An 80-year-old stutterer. Perfect. He's not going in with a big, strong, sword-wielding, handsome, 6'5", dark, tall, and handsome dude that has the charismatic following. No, he went in with a broken down, stuttering old shepherd. God's approach. I'm not here to impress you. I'll impress you with my words. I'll impress you with my character. I'll impress you with what I'm offering, but I'm not going to impress you any other way. He doesn't do the intimidation game. So it's one of the things I always tell people. When we read a prophecy and it appears that it's talking about us, is don't gloat. What that means is that you're that stuttering, broken down shepherd that he's going to use. So you got picked because of your inadequacies. So don't be doing any bragging over it. That was the thing I think
That's
when we were talking. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's like being the chosen people. A lot of the initial reaction is, "Hey, we're special." It's like, "Hey, this is you're not necessarily chosen, and it's going to be all like cookies and cream. You're chosen to be the one that's going to be held to the highest standard, and it's going to suck."
Yep. The one thing that's unique, there's actually two things unique about Jews that is decidedly uncommon. You know what the two things are?
I can't think of them.
Single thing that's most important in getting to know God is intelligence, being able to think your way to him because God wants to be known, not believed. The average Jewish IQ is 115 points, is 15 points above the norm. It is overwhelmingly the highest average IQ of any people in human history. It is why 40% of the Nobel Prizes and most important developments in science have been achieved by a people that represent less than 0.2% of the overall population.
So I guess my Catholic delusion is what keeps me below 115.
I think that's probably the case. Now, the second is that Jews have a high propensity to marry other Jews. It's the only real ethnicity that has endured, 3,000 years. 3,500 years. It's a long time for a people to still have an identity. Now, they are a little bit dyslexic here and there. I mean, we know that there are about 7.5 million Jews in Israel. There's about 7.5 million Jews in America. There's about 2 million Jews dispersed throughout the rest of the world. What most people don't know is how many Jews are Jews that don't know they're Jews. For example, almost every significant Islamic leader is Jewish. Muhammad was Jewish. The majority of the Roma, the gypsies that have been harassed in Europe and were part of the Holocaust, they're Jewish. God gives a very succinct description of where the supposed lost tribes were lost and where he is collecting them from. And when you run DNA tests, DNA has been just this extraordinarily important tool. You run DNA tests of peoples in those areas, they're Jewish. One of the real frustrating things today for Muslims is they're running DNA tests, and the brightest of them, the most empowered of them, are coming back with Jewish ethnicity. Erdogan, he's a Jew. King Abdullah in Jordan, he's a Jew. So, it's an interesting thing is when God's calling his people home, there's a lot of Jews who accepted religions to keep from dying. The Roman Catholic Church was you'll either convert or we're going to torture you and kill you, and that's an incentive for a lot of people. Do I want to be tortured to death, or do I want to live? And the choice here is I have to agree with them if I want to live. Maybe I'll go along with that. And the same thing was true with Islam. And so there are lots of Jews today that are converso, that converted to those religions. Now, fortunately for my mission, which is to call Yisrael and Yehuda home, 80% of those people who know they're Jewish are not religious. They're atheists and agnostics. And most atheists and agnostics, if they'll take the time to consider the evidence, will accept Yahweh. I have not seen anybody who has devoted the time to this who hasn't come to the conclusion that Yah is real, that he proves himself, and that what he's offering is wonderfully acceptable. Because we talked. You mentioned that the nonsense that the Earth is 6 days old. Well, one of the very first things we did was translate the creation account. And we found out, and this was just a mind blower for me, that we actually can measure the rate the time flowed at creation, because the creation account is told from the perspective of the Creator at creation. And he says that the universe, from the time that energy coalesced into matter, because time doesn't move, doesn't flow until matter exists. On just a photon of light, pure energy, there is no movement of time. So time begins to flow when light energy coalesces into matter. It's called quark confinement. And we know from the cosmic background microwave radiation exactly how the speed of time, the speed that time flowed at creation. And it flowed based upon the microwave radiation at 10 to the 12th power more slowly than it moves here on Earth. And that's Einstein's theory of relativity, that time is relative for each observer depending on their proximity to great energy, matter, or speed, velocity. And so we know that time...
Someone from the center of the Big Bang is looking ahead from the Big Bang, seeing in 4 dimensions, and saying, in your parlance, using using time systems, this is you're going to see it differently, but from translating over here to me, because I am going so much faster or slower relative to each other. What is a day? Because just stand back for a lot of people. They may have experienced it a lot of times. In fact, even when you and I first started talking, we said, what was the word, Edon or something, or I can't recall.
Yeah, Edon.
It's like it could just be referring to not a literal day, but just kind of like an era.
But that's not,
which maybe it could, but if you actually, but what I actually said is, from a relativity perspective, it actually could be a 24-hour, what we perceive or would consider a 24-hour period, but something at such a difference in energy and speed, it could be perceived as a 4 billion or 8 billion year in one perspective is 24 hours in another.
Yeah, but if you look at the cosmic microwave background radiation, we know that time was slowed by 10 to the 12th power at the Big Bang. And if you divide 14 billion years by 10 to the 12th power, you get 6 24-hour days. So it's not a question of was the Earth created in 6 24-hour days, or was it created in 14 billion years? The answer is yes. Depends on your perspective. Where were you?
Right.
If you're at creation, it was 6 24-hour days. Gets us to right here we are now. If you're here on Earth, which Earth didn't even exist at the beginning of it because we're the product of a second generation star because of the heavy elements. The heavy elements only exist with a star that goes through its death throes and goes through supernova. And without that, you can't have carbon and other heavy elements. So we're the product of a second generation star. But if we are measuring time based upon the way it flows here on Earth, it is 14 billion years, and yet if you were at the Big Bang, it's 6 24-hour days. They are exactly the same. Then the next thing we found is that the account of the flood says that in Hebrew that the flood will be initiated with an upwelling of deep sea water. And then you find the Burkle impact crater that hit the Earth 5,000 years ago, not far from the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and that it sent up, and we have absolute proof that it sent up a tsunami 500 feet tall right up through the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, right across and into the Black Sea, which at the time was fresh water 5,000 years ago, and instantly changed to salt water, rose 500 feet in a day, and then washed out through the Bosphorus Straits. And we have proof of all of that, and that's the exact region that Yahowah said was flooded, and it was flooded as a direct result of the asteroid impact and the upwelling of deep sea water. And of course, when that's the debris of an asteroid hit of that size, you're going to have rain for the period of time that Yahowah said. Happened exactly as he said he would. And then you say, all right, where would the ark be if, based upon this volcanic range of Ararat, which is near the Black Sea, with Eden being pinpointed at Lake Van because he names the 4 rivers that flow out of it. Where would the ark be? And lo and behold, you look on Google Map, and there's the ark. It's right there. The Turks have built a national park for it. The only reason that more people don't know about it, and you can look on Google Maps and see it right there, is that that's an area where a high percentage of Kurds live, and therefore there's constant infighting between the Turks and the Kurds, and it's a dangerous place to go. But the ark
it's within sight of the Iranian border too.
Yeah, it is.
So.
Yep. So
I've seen a video. I actually just watched a video last week of a guy that took up a drone with a camera, standing on parts of the remnants of it, and he was saying, I got to be a little careful about this because I think right over there is the Iranian outpost, and I guarantee someone's watching me right now.
Yeah, it's a dangerous place to go. And so when you're doing these kind of things, and then you're every week, I have a friend that is a covenant member that sends me an article almost every week about an archaeological discovery. And every time there's something that Yahowah said about there's a community here, a city here, a people here, an event that took place here. It took place at this time, and this was the details about who was here, what their name was, and what was unique about them. And they find it. And it is that name. It was at that time. It was in that place. And to have thousands of these, and every time the archaeology is 100% consistent with what God said. The Mishneh stone, was such a great example because the language, the alphabet, happens to be Hebrew, and it talks about the kingdom of Dowd. It specifically mentions Yahweh, and it confirms the events that the story in the Torah speaks about. And so prophecy isn't just getting the future right, it's also having the past precisely right. And so there's so many thousands of these that the only rational conclusion is that the individual who inspired all of this, this history from creation all the way through the end of the world as we know it, exists outside of the confines of time so that he could report historical events to Moshe, that he could then write them down, and then we could later on confirm that what he wrote down was precisely accurate, and then go all the way through the end of time where every aspect of what's taking place now with the United States and Russia and China and the Islamic world, with the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq and giving Iraq to Iran and then subsequently spilling into Syria, and what's going to happen thereafter, every detail of it has been laid out, thousands of years before it occurs. So that's the reason that ultimately we've chosen to put our trust and reliance in Yahweh as he proves its existence. He proved that he authored these stories, and he uses prophecy so that we can credibly rely upon what he says he is like, what he's offering, and what he expects in return. All rational.
Yeah.
Well, we're way past the broadcast point, and we've just been in the recording point. Boy, Yoel, it is fun to have you back.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's been a good refresher for me, and great to be yammering about all these fun things again. Yeah,
and we'll continue with Matt and Yah as we go forward, because again, this was something you intuitively knew. But as we go through the details, I think you're going to be amazed as to how much confirmation there is that what you suspected is true. And is it going to help you? Of course not. You already knew it. But is it going to help somebody who is questioning Christianity and needs some evidence to get off the fence?
Oh yeah, this is amazing. I mean, I just kind of said it doesn't really serve. I don't see a need to, delve into, any of this New Testament stuff. But knowing how prolific it is and doing what you've done to painstakingly analyze how truly off-putting the details get as you dig into them more, I think that's extremely amazing and valuable.
I think it is for people. I think that there's a reason that God goes out of his way to expose and condemn religious and political myths. He wants us to know why these things are wrong, because until we disassociate from them, we can't be part of his family. So I think it's important to follow his example and to do it. And sometimes I think we have to blend both. This is what God said that's nurturing and beneficial, and this is what God said is counterproductive. You've raised your 3 children, and you can't just tell them what's the right thing to do. Sometimes you also have to tell them what's the wrong thing to do and explain why it's wrong.
Oh, definitely.
And that's what we're doing. Well, I think Kirk has had to check out. That's why we don't have his voice. He's trying to deal with an upcoming surgery again. I think for Terry, his wife, it's been a real difficult ordeal. She's back in the hospital in San Francisco. That's where he was actually speaking to us from her hospital room, and said that he would come and go as they were doing tests to try to resolve the infections that she's suffering with. But man, it's good to be back with you, my friend.
Well, same here.
Yeah.
And I hope things with Kirk and his wife can go as well as possible. But sounds not.
We may be at a point where she's going to get to Shamayim a little before the rest of us, and with all the anguish and difficult pain that she has gone through, be a really good thing. We would miss her tremendously, and no matter what happens, if she has a miraculous release from the infections after all of these surgeries, and we get to enjoy her company here a little longer, and she is wonderful. If she just beats us to Shamayim by the blink of an eye and eternal time, well, that's going to be fine too. So we just wish that she has a minimal amount of suffering, and that Kirk and Terry are really comfortable with the decisions they make. One of my frustrations, Yoel, is that the medical system that we have seems to want to enrich doctors and hospitals for painfully elongating the last days, weeks, months of someone's life, and they turn people into their means to make a living, and what they do to them is sometimes torturous, and so I'm concerned that that's kind of what's happening now to Terry, is that she's a source of income for the hospital and the doctors, but they're making her worse, not better. So,
I hope that's not the case, but
yeah. All right. Well, best to you. Yoel, look forward to talking to you this week as we try to make some progress on getting some of our newer books up and on various sites, and looking forward to that's going to be a fun project. We've had a lot of fun in the past, and I'm sure we will once again. Thanks for being with us tonight, Yoel. Good night. Happy Shabbat to one and all.
Yep. Take care, all.
Yep. Good night.